Well, we've got a fun episode of the podcast today. As I promised, we have guest speakers. So you may not have known that this guy that normally is sitting in the congregation is actually the Reverend Mike Hubbard. And his wife, Terry, is also the Reverend Terry Hubbard. They both come to us from the Mountain Sky Conference. You moved here to be with your grandchildren, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes, so they get to spend a lot of extra time, and probably your daughter, right, is pretty happy to have somebody.
Oh, she's ecstatic. She leans on us a lot.
Yes, that's the dream, to have your parents close. So we are so thrilled to have you here this morning. So we are in a new sermon series, and this one is pretty fun. It's called Remember, and if you've seen it anywhere, is it up on the screen somewhere? Oh yeah, it is. So you see how there's like the little brackets that say remember? That's because there's a bit of a double meaning. So part of it is that we are going to be remembering some of sort of these really like meaty faith stories in the Bible about certain characters, but also these characters that we're going to be talking about Jacob today. He makes some mistakes, and yet God remembers him into his family, into his faith community. And so there's not just the remembering part that we're doing, but we see how God remembers people. We also, for those of you that follow along in the Atlas, there are a bunch of memoirs that are listed in the Atlas that go along with this series. There are some podcasts. There is music also. For those of you that are hearing me say the Atlas and wondering what the heck I'm talking about, that is a book that we publish every August that gives the run of the sermon series throughout the entire year through May. And so if you don't have one of those atlases, there are printed books around the church. Megan just wonderfully put up this QR code. You can scan the QR code and get the PDF version on your phone. But it really adds to some of the richness, I think, that is available to us as we go through a certain series. So just check out that, look at some of the memoirs. If you're looking for things to read, it might be kind of fun. So as I said, we're talking about Jacob this morning. So that puts us in Genesis 32, 22 through 32. Now, this is just a snippet of a story. I'm going to give a little bit of background. Mike and I are going to talk about it just in case you don't have the whole story of Jacob just settled in your brain. But we're going to look at this one little event of a wrestling match with Jacob. So it says, the same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. Okay, Mike. So I want to start, let's talk a little bit more about Jacob here, okay? So like what we're seeing is like kind of an isolated incident. It's an important one, but an incident in the story of Jacob. What had Jacob been up to ahead of this?
Well, it's really interesting that in the book of Genesis, the story of Jacob takes up about a third of the whole book. So the little snippet that Carol just read is just a tiny piece, and I recommend that you go in and read the whole story. It's a really interesting story because Jacob, when Carol asked me if I would be a part of this, I thought, has she heard my story? Because a lot that Jacob went through, he was a liar, a cheat, a thief, just not a really nice guy, out for himself most of the time. And so as we get into this story, we kind of get a twist, a turning point in Jacob's life. We may talk about more that I don't know where you're going, Carol.
Yeah, well, that's part of the fun of the podcast. It's a little scary, so you don't know for sure what we're going to say. But yeah, we talked about this earlier, but for those of you that don't really remember the full story of Jacob, I know it's hard to hold all of these things in your mind. Jacob had notoriously tricked his older brother. So Jacob was the son of Isaac and Rebekah. And so to connect that back a little bit, Isaac is the son of Abraham and Sarah. That's like Father Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons.
Good lineage.
Yes, and then Sarah is the one that had Isaac when she was like 90 years old, okay? So then now Isaac is grown up, and Rebekah has 2 twin boys, and Esau is the oldest by just a few minutes. And Jacob isn't super happy about that, right? Because Esau gets all of the birthright and the blessing and all of that.
Firstborn son gets everything.
Yes. And so Jacob kind of devises some plans to cheat his brother out of things. So Mike mentioned he was a cheat and a liar. And one of the things he did, which y'all will hear this story and maybe be disgusted, but I kind of get it. Esau had been out hunting one day. He came back super tired, and Jacob was there cooking some
And
stew.
hungry. He was hungry too.
Yeah, Esau was super hungry, as you would be if you'd been out on some hunting expedition. And so Jacob was like, listen, I'll pour you a bowl of soup right now if you'll swap me your birthright. And in a moment of hunger, Esau says yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so he cheats him out of it, which if y'all are judging Esau, which I get it, you're like, what the heck? This is your birthright for one bowl of stew. I have discovered that I've basically traded my kids' college fund for DoorDash delivery. So I'm like, I can see how it sort of happened. And then also, when Isaac was near death and going to give Esau a blessing, which that was a really important thing, then Jacob dressed up as Esau, and Isaac's sight was going, and basically tricked his father, who was near death, into giving him the blessing that actually belonged to Esau. So,
And
yeah.
I don't think Esau was very happy about that.
No, Esau was not. Go
Because
ahead.
he vowed right then, when he found out that Jacob had gotten his blessing, he vowed that as soon as his father died, Jacob was going right in the same place.
That's right. He was going to kill Jacob, and Jacob got scared, and so Jacob runs to his uncle's house. And we could preach a whole separate thing about what happens at the uncle's house, but let's just say when we get to the part of the story where we are today, he's coming back to his home after all sorts of drama happened with the uncle, with 2 sisters to which he's married to. So check out Genesis 29 through 31 if you want to get that whole story. But so Jacob has done some things. It hasn't been a perfect life. And then here we are. There's this kind of, I don't know, like confusing, strange story where he starts wrestling with someone. At first we think it's a man, right?
I wonder if at that time Jacob thought, "Oh, Esau's caught up with me, and I'm about to die."
Right.
Because he knew Esau had planned to kill him, and that's why he ran away. And so this person that he wrestles with all night, I really identify with. I ran away from a lot of things. Let me start. When I was a teenager, I was very active in the church, and I really started feeling this call that God wanted something more out of me. But I ran as fast and as far away as I could for most of my adult life. But then I ran away to my uncle's house. It was Uncle Sam, and was in the Air Force for 21 years until finally. I came to this realization that I remembered something in my past that when everything in my life fell apart, that I could come back to something. And the wrestling match really it really touches me because I think we all, if we're honest with ourselves, we all wrestle with who and where. What do we need to do next? What do we need to do with the stuff that is bothering us? And we don't know a lot of times what to do with that.
Well, I think you brought up this interesting idea, right? Because you're talking about how, you came to a point in your life where you had this call on your life, you had decided to do something else, and then sort of this wrestling match occurs that's within you. And so I think that's kind of one of the interesting things that we have in this story, because it's not just extremely clear. And so we are able to leave this up to interpretation. So was Jacob wrestling with another man? Was Jacob actually wrestling with himself?
I think there's a large part of that he's wrestling with his conscience, his past, and not just the past with Esau, but also the past with his uncle. And he knows all the ungodly things that he's done in his life. And so, yes, I think he's wrestling with himself, but I think that part, we're created in the image of God. And so there's a piece of God in us all the time. So when Jacob is wrestling with himself, I think he's also wrestling with that piece of God in him. I know there's something more in me, but I can't identify it right now. And so all through the night, he's wrestling with this idea that there's something more for me, even though I have not been a very good person. And I recognize that in my story too.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about how, so there's this interesting part, right? Because it says in the scripture that he sent his wives and his crew and his livestock and everything else ahead of him across the Jabbok River. And so this night, he's alone, right?
Right.
And so I think there's this question of what does it say that Jacob was in solitude when this wrestling match occurred?
I don't know about you, but I'm distracted by a whole lot of stuff in life. And sometimes we pick those distractions to keep from thinking about the things we should be thinking and praying and living. And Jacob sent his family away because he didn't want them to get hurt when Esau came. But I think when we're alone, those distractions are taken away. And so we're able to see more deeply into who we are and what we are and whose we are. And so I admit that I'm not good at meditation. My wife will attest to that. I seek out distractions because I don't want to see things and face things. But at some point, it catches up.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and I think that's an interesting part of this story. So there is this time that he takes away, right? And that's when all of these things start to come up. So he's wrestling with himself. He may have been wrestling with some man in the night, but I think there are a few things that I feel certain about in this story. And it's that God was there, right, when the wrestling happened, and that Jacob also was physically hurt in the wrestling of this and walks away with the limp. But I want to kind of get back to this idea of what does it mean to us that when we are in the middle of struggles in our lives, or when everything else is taken away and we're sitting in the silence trying to figure out what is this? Who even am I? What does it mean to us that God is there?
Well, I think that's a testament to the fact that God is always there. And I think of the 25 years of my adult life that I ran away, turned my back on God. God was always there with me. And I think that's an awareness that, excuse me, sometimes we don't like to admit, because sometimes we don't want God to be there. I want to hide some of this
Sure.
stuff. And so, in this time where we're wrestling with ourselves and wrestling with that God image in us, which I believe firmly that it's in all of us, no matter how many distractions we choose, that this 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 wrestling is something that I recommend and I hate, but because it does cause pain. I limp, but I used to limp with my hips, but I've got 2 artificial hips now, so I don't limp that way anymore.
You know what's kind of funny is that, so we had bowling night on Friday night, and I tested. I would pull a muscle, and I did. And I tell you what, I have got shooting pain on this left side of my hip, and I'm like, how appropriate for today that I'm preaching this sermon about Jacob that I can, have got some stiffness.
What do you want to confess, Carol?
I'm just saying, it's there. But I think that kind of leads us to our next question. You've already alluded to it a little bit, but Jacob walks away limping after this encounter with God. And I think there is this question of what does it tell us about spiritual growth, the cost of spiritual growth and transformation?
When we come out of this wrestling match, I think the limp that is referred to here is just a reminder of what we've been through. Sometimes when we go through these wrestling matches, we want to forget about it. But with that limp, and Jacob limped for the rest of his life, that he was able to remember that no matter how far and how fast he ran away from the presence of God, that God was always there. And when he decided to go back home and face the music, so to speak, that God was going to be there with him, even though he hadn't been very godly.
I shared this article with you. I found a essay by this really brilliant writer. Her name's Debbie Thomas. She's at a church in Palo Alto, California, and she speaks about this part of like the limp, right? This is what she writes. She says, "We live in a culture that celebrates success and scorns defeat, but sometimes defeat is a mercy. Defeat is what saves us. What I carry away from the story of Jacob's wounding is the troubling but rock-solid truth that blessing and bruising are not mutually exclusive in the realm of God. We can limp and prevail at the same time. We can experience healing and brokenness. If I want to engage with God, then I must expect that I will be changed in the process, and not always in ways that are painless or comfortable or easy. I can't dictate the terms of a blessing. I can't say I want the blessing but not the limp. Sometimes the blessing is the limp." It's that last line that really has stood out to me. Sometimes the blessing is the limp. What does that mean to you?
It means to pay attention, for one thing, and then the limp calls your attention back. That having God in my life is a blessing.
Yeah.
But sometimes I forget that because I want to be the blessing. And for a long time, for me, I was God. I could do anything.
Yeah.
But then then I couldn't.
Yeah.
And then that's the strength that came from that. Sometimes leads us to things that we hadn't even considered. Like shortly after that time, I met Terry, and we got married. And a year later, we were both in seminary.
Yeah.
For crying out loud, and that was. I don't know. Don't be afraid to face God in this. That doesn't mean you're going to go to seminary, but really, sometimes we just need to be reminded, and sometimes we're reminded by a person. Sometimes we're reminded by an event. Sometimes I was reminded when I came into here. Reverend Handy Joe led me here. And when I walked into this room in this service, I remembered, and I was brought back into the grace that was always there.
You remembered and you were remembered, which I think
Yes.
that's something so poignant about this, and really does lead me to my next question, which is God blesses Jacob after the struggle, and how do we see God's grace at work in this passage, even though Jacob had a complicated past?
I think, as I think back in my life, I know that I've left a trail of brokenness. And some was caused by me and some was inflicted on me by others. But through it all, there's that abiding grace and love that we can't fathom, that we can't really understand a lot of times, and sometimes we feel like we don't deserve it. I think Jacob probably felt I've blown it. I'm out. I can't be of really much value, and I'm going to face Esau. And if he kills me, then that's what I deserve. But there's this element of Christopher has mentioned several times this idea of prevenient grace, the grace that we're born into, that we can't avoid, that we're always a part of. It's when we look at that and say, okay, I accept that grace and I think that's where Jacob was at that point. I accept that grace. When at the end, when the person that asked, "What's your name?" Jacob was forced to say his name. In the Old Testament times, the name was more than what you're called by, and the name of Jacob meant trickster, supplanter, and all that. And so, liar, thief, and all those things. And when Jacob said, "My name is Jacob," he had to face, okay, I am a liar, a thief, a trickster. And then God says, "No longer. You have a new name, Israel." And this very broken man, Jacob, with his 12 sons and a daughter, the 12 sons became the head of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right.
And so Jacob was named Israel, and that meant that, okay, God said, okay, yeah, you've blown it in the past, but that's okay. We're in this together now.
Yeah, well, and I think that just speaks so much to who God is, right? Because one thing that I find interesting is when we were telling the story about how he had tricked his father earlier and pretended that he was Esau, in that story, when Isaac is asking Jacob, "Who are you? What is your name?" he says it's Esau. And I think it's a really fascinating little thing that we see in this story that's done, because there's a point when he is asked, "What is your name?" and he lies about it. And I think that there is a piece of him that maybe didn't even know himself who he was. And he goes through this wrestling moment. And then the question is, "What is your name?" And
Okay,
it's
yeah.
Jacob.
I'm Jacob.
Yes, and he finally is able to say who he really is. He's finally come to this point in his life who he knows. And what he discovers is this abundant grace. No, that's not who you are anymore. You are Israel. You are the one who strives with God. And as Mike pointed out, Israel is the reason why we say the Israelites. His 12 sons are the 12 tribes. And so I think the good news here is that this abundant grace that God gave to Israel is available for us. And we see it time and time again in the Bible, right?
Most of you, some of you, maybe most of you are familiar with that little poem, Footprints in the Sand, when the man has a dream and he's walking with Jesus through the sand. He sees the footprints. There's two sets of footprints as they walk along. And then he comes to the point in his life that really his life is falling apart. And everything is trash. And he sees that right then there's only one set of footprints. And he asks Jesus, "Why weren't you with me in the most difficult times in my life?" And the answer is, oh, my son, it was then that I carried you. And I think that's what Jacob is. It comes to that realization that through all of his brokenness, all of his treachery, that he was being carried into this place right now, into this moment right then, that he was remembered. He was brought back into the grace of God that was always there, but now he recognized it.
And I really think that says a lot about the grace of God and who God is. And one thing that I wanted to make sure that I pointed out, I pointed you guys to the Atlas earlier, and I talked about memoirs. But when Mike and I were talking this week, I was telling him one of the memoirs that I had put in the Atlas was this one called Counting the Cost. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the show 19 Kids and Counting, but it was one that was pretty popular for a while. And the author of Counting the Cost is Jill Duggar Dillard. She is, I believe, the second oldest daughter. And if you followed that family for a while, you know that there's been a lot of stuff that has happened. And this book is so interesting because as a little girl, the way that she was trained in sort of her Christian fundamentalist home was that approval from her parents was the number one thing to go after. And so her dad called her Sweet Jilly Muffin, and that was her name all throughout, her childhood into young adulthood, my sweet Jilly Muffin, my sweet Jilly Muffin. And there came this time in her life where she ends up having to wrestle with some things. She has to wrestle with how her dad has handled the money, even when she's become an adult, not compensating her for her time on the show. And then she has to grapple with the fact that she was she was told to cover up the abuse of her older brother, who was later arrested in 2021 very publicly. And so she went through this time in her life where she wrestled too. And I think what's fascinating is that she comes out of this story no longer Sweet Jilly Muffin. Her name was changed into something else, Jill Dillard. And I think the thing that this sort of highlights is in our story of Jacob created the mess, right? Jacob created this mess, brought these things on himself for the most part. In this story, Jill did not create this mess. This mess happened to her. And I think it's a good reminder for us as we're sitting here thinking about this story of Jacob and struggling with God to remember that we are all going to have messes in our lives. Unfortunately, in this life, there will be trouble. That is a guarantee. No matter how it comes, there are going to be things that we are going to wrestle over. And I think it's important to remember that no matter what it looks like, God is there in the wrestling.
And it's also, I think, important in our current situation to remember that those people that we maybe don't like very much, or maybe even think that we hate them, are part of that same grace. They're part of that same family. And so when we accept that God's grace, we tend to see people in a different way. We tend to look at people, I think.
Oh, I agree.
In a different way. When we begin to forgive ourselves through the grace of God's forgiveness, we see others in a new way and begin to approach life with a new strength and a new power.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the heart of the invitation today is in the wrestling, good things come out of it, right? Even though it's hard.
Yes, absolutely. It hurts. I'm not saying that it doesn't hurt, but it's worth it. And part of the thing, as we talked about this, I thought about the community values that we say before each service. Which one of the things that really attracted me to this place were those community values that last tagline that we all join on is without exception we belong, and that means the people that we may distrust, but look at them a different way. We don't know their story in a lot of cases, and we all have our stories that brought us here, no matter if we're 5 years old or 95 years old or 105 years old. We all have our stories that mold the person that other people see. And that's one of the scary parts is other people. What do other people see in me? Do they see Jesus in me?
And I think that's part of what comes out in the wrestling, right?
Yes.
Is this, sometimes it's within the wrestling, it's within the limp that this crack kind of comes and people are finally able to see that light of Christ in you. And
Absolutely.
and the way you were talking about the way that you view other people, that also comes out, right? Because once you have this love and this mercy that Christ kind of stirs up in you, then it pours out from you when it relates to others.
And you may not even recognize it.
Yeah.
It becomes a part of you.
Yeah, it really does. And I think so many times you just have to go through the wrestling to get there.
You have to, yeah. It's one of the great. It is the greatest thing, but in order to get to the great things, you have to hurt a little bit, I think,
Yeah, I think
or else you don't know that they're great. you
yeah,
know?
I think that's so true. Well, Mike, it's been so awesome to have you with me. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this and deal with all of my questions. And I know everybody's super enjoyed hearing from you. But I want to close today. I took a section of this poem Mike had sent me from Jan Richardson. If you guys don't know her, she is an awesome poet. She has so many wonderful writings on so many subjects. But man, I really think that she hits it on the head in this poem and kind of helps us put our arms around what we're talking about. So I'm gonna close with this. She says, "If this blessing were easy, anyone could claim it. As it is, I am here to tell you that it will take some work. This is the blessing that visits you in the struggling, in the wrestling, in the striving. This is the blessing that comes after you have left everything behind, after you have stepped out, after you have crossed into that realm beyond every landmark you have known. This is the blessing that takes all night to find. It's not that this blessing is so difficult, as if it were not filled with grace or with the love that lives in every line. It is simply that it requires you to want it, to ask for it, to place yourself in its path. It demands that you stand to meet it when it arrives, that you stretch yourself in ways you didn't know you could move, that you agree to not give up."